So we we have Holly Kemper. She is a prevention and intervention specialist at North County Lifeline, and Maisha Butler Ibawi. I hope I'm pronouncing that okay. Ibawi, sorry, thank you. Campus advocacy coordinator for the San Diego Community College District. So I want to give you both an opportunity to talk about yourself a little bit, just about your work, what you do for the communities. But first, I'm going to turn it over to Elspeth from the Women's Resource Center, just to talk about a little bit why we're here, what Take Back the Week, why we're all here today.
Sounds good.
Awesome. Hi, everybody. So nice to see you all. Thank you so much for joining us for this event, and thank you, PPGA, for organizing. My name is Elspeth Islas. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm the interim assistant director for the Women's Resource Center. So this event is a part of Take Back, which is the collaborative effort across SDSU to really highlight awareness on sexual assault and to provide support to survivors. So thank you all so much again, and yeah, I'll go ahead and turn it back to Delaney. Okay, I think my connection was really bad, so I think folks maybe had a hard time hearing me. I'll go ahead and say it again. Hopefully people can understand me a little bit better. So thank you again for coming here, making time out of your schedules to join us for this really, really amazing event. So my name is Elspeth Islas, my pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm the interim assistant director at the Women's Resource Center. And this event was organized by Planned Parenthood Generation Action as a part of Take Back the Week. So Take Back the Week is a collaborative effort across all SDSU to highlight awareness on sexual assault and provide support to survivors. So we've had a really great lineup of events hosted by various departments and student organizations, and we still have a few more events lined up. So if you want to go ahead and learn more about Take Back the Week, you can follow the Women's Motion Instagram as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Elspeth. Okay, so let's just go ahead and get started then. I have a list of questions here, so feel free to answer or maybe pass along if you don't feel like answering that question. So first, just kind of a very basic thing. So for those folks who may not know much about human trafficking or know of its prominence, especially in our city, like what is an easy way to explain what it looks like?
Oh, is this open for the panelists?
Yes. So
okay.
Yeah. So I guess if you want to like go back and forth, whatever feels comfortable with you, that'll be okay.
Right. So, I mean, there's a couple different ways to understand human trafficking. There's a cultural and a street way to understand it, and then there's also a legal perspective and definition of human trafficking. And so human trafficking is a legal definition or a legal term used to define the kidnapping or the force of folks into either labor work that doesn't include sex or labor work that does include sex. And so that's like in a nutshell. But the ways that manifests and the ways that looks across cultures or in the streets can look a little different, sound a little different, show up a little different. But I'll just leave it at that for right now.
Yeah, and that was great. I can add to that. I think that we all think of sex trafficking. When we think of it, we a lot of the times imagine like a movie like Taken, where that's one kind of way that it might happen. And that's a good depiction of kind of that force, right? And that kidnapping version of sex trafficking. But there also could be circumstances where maybe people are either coerced or frauded into sex trafficking also. So I think that there's a common misconception. We have to remember it's not always kidnapping. A lot of times people are coerced into it too. And so we see it all kinds of different ways, you know, in massage parlors, through pornography, through in the strip clubs. But those are just some of the ways. So it looks different depending on the situation.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Thank you so much. Okay. So, for those who don't know, San Diego is the 8th largest city in the United States for human trafficking. And people, whenever I have said that to other folks, people are often really surprised to hear that. So I'm wondering why you think that may be, that there is that surprise, and then what are some of the major effects that we see in our city because of it?
I'll start with this one. So, you know, our city, we have a lot of unique things kind of going on that make us a hotspot. For one, we're a major tourist destination. And so there's kind of that, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas thing. You know, when you go on vacation, inhibitions are kind of lower. And so people are maybe doing things that they wouldn't normally do, like purchasing sex. We also have, we're a border city. And so a lot of like drug trafficking happens across the border. Tijuana is also a hotspot for sex trafficking. And so we see a lot of that happening back and forth. And then also we have the military culture here. And so that contributes to kind of like that, those gender norms that also add to sex trafficking being prominent.
Yeah. I think just to expound upon that, I think it's really important to, in the work, and I don't know, maybe one of the questions may ask this, but I may be diving into it a little early, but to look at what and who human trafficking is really affecting, right, in the city of San Diego. And it's been in my work, particularly when we talk about CSEC, which is commercially sexually exploited children. The majority of folks that I see it affecting and impacting are largely Black girls here in the city of San Diego. And so there's a couple of different reasons for that, right? But for any of us that are familiar with doing research and data, we do know that the smaller a population is, right, in any given place, right, when something is impacting them, it's going to affect them harder because there's smaller populations. So we know that Black folks, African Americans, make up about maybe 3 to 5% of the population here in San Diego. But in my time in working with CSEC, I want to say close to 95% of the girls who were in human trafficking, whether that was as an adult or as a child, were primarily Black girls or Black women. And so, again, when we talk about who it's affecting, we have to look at who's marginalized, right? Who's most marginalized in society? Why are they being marginalized? And then when we talk about this being a border town, right? When we talk about the realities of what it means to be in a border city, and to have people, brown folks that are constantly being economically disenfranchised as a result of being in a border town, of living in this type of climate that we're living in. Of course, human trafficking, sex trafficking, labor trafficking is going to show up and affect them in very different ways. So yeah, I think a lot of that has to do with a lot of why it shows up here in very unique ways.
Thank you for sharing all of that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so moving forward, asking a little bit more about you two. We know that there's a lot of organizations that are out there that are present to help survivors. So I'm kind of wondering maybe what sort of programs are out there to help survivors, what programs are both of y'all a part of, a little bit more about what you do. And if you did want to share a little bit more about your background, maybe why you got into this work, why you're in this field, I think we would love to know more about that.
Yeah, for sure. So, hi, everybody. My name is Maisha, pronoun she, her, hers. And I am originally from Oakland, East Oakland, California. And I grew up, I didn't have the language for this, of course, at 15, 16 years old. I didn't know it was like human trafficking or sex trafficking. And I saw it as more just like pimping and hoeing, is really the sort of colloquial terms of talking about this. And so I grew up around a lot of this, and it was seen as normal and acceptable. And then as I started to study, when I got to college and I majored in communications with a minor in race and resistance and started to study things like Black sexuality and looking at the historical context of Black sexuality, I became interested in the ways that sexuality had took shape within the lives of Black people, and just found myself in these jobs and in these spaces, whether it was working with Black queer folks, whether it was working with Black women, and finding that sexual trauma, whether it was childhood sexual abuse or CSEC, tended to be a theme within these different populations. And so I found myself working at San Diego Youth Services, which has two programs. Well, they did at the time that I was working there. I don't know what they look like now. But STARS and iCare, which specialize in providing CSEC and human trafficking services to youth who have been impacted by CSEC and human trafficking. And so those are some of the programs that I've worked for that specifically focus on that. But we do have, I do think it's important to highlight that with a lot of these programs, and I'm just gonna keep it real because I think that truth is important to being able to dismantle oppression. A lot of these programs I find are not equipped to be able to handle the realities of especially when you have Black and brown youth coming in or Black and brown folks coming in who are impacted by CSEC and human trafficking, are not equipped to be able to heal the historical context that is lays at the crux of that trauma. And so I think it's important to highlight community organizations and community folks who are former sex workers, former human trafficking survivors, and pimps, former pimps who are doing the work in San Diego. So there's a number of those different folks here in San Diego that are doing a lot of curriculum education through various nonprofit organizations here in San Diego.
Yeah, thank you, Maisha. It's great to learn more about you. So I'm Holly Kempler. I am the Prevention and Intervention Specialist with North County Lifeline's Project Life program. And so we're primarily a victim service provider through a larger nonprofit. So what that means is we provide all kinds of different services for victims, including like law enforcement response, from the get-go when maybe a victim is identified by law enforcement and they're interested in services. We provide intensive case management services, therapy services, as well as peer support and also clinical trainings. And then we also do some prevention work, which is kind of more what I'm focused on, which is really educating youth in our community and individuals who come in contact with a lot of youth so that they know how to pick up the signs and, be able to support and connect youth with the right services or, whatever that might look like. So I am a clinical social worker. I come from a background of working quite a bit with youth in like high crisis situations, like youth who are having homicidal ideation, suicidal ideation, and psychosis. And so through that, I also did a lot of work with schools and lots of different sectors in the community, like hospitals and things like that. And kind of something that I've always noticed, of course, is something that ties us all together is we all have experienced some level of trauma in our life, some more than others. And in my work in various settings, I came across youth who had CSEC experience and histories. And so that's what led me to this field. I really wanted to learn more and to be able to provide services directly related to that. So I did initially work more as a case manager at my job, and then I moved into more of that prevention role. And I also do provide therapy services to a lot of our youth who are involved in our RISE court system, that's our court specifically for youth who are CSEC identified or high risk for CSEC. So I'm directly involved with that.
Awesome. Thank you too so much for what you do for the community. I know that this kind of work can be tough. So both of you mentioned a lot about kind of like the risk factors, especially for like children who have been in like the commercially sexual exploitation or at risk. So I think it would be good if you could talk a little bit more about those risk factors, especially if like for the students who, we come to San Diego, we're away from home, we're away from our family. And then also talking about how, like, first identifying the signs and how we can recognize it, and what we can do to prevent that.
Oh, yeah, that's a large question that I don't know if I can do justice in such a short answer, but what I will say is that, there's tons of different risk factors that contribute to that. The reality is that any one of us, right, could be at risk. We live in such a harmful and violent society. And the harm and the violence that's caused to many of us makes us vulnerable to the realities of CSEC and human trafficking. And so again, my perspective and what I come from, because I think that this is, as if you all can't already tell, this is a perspective that is largely still missing from when we talk about human trafficking and CSEC, is systems of oppression. Racism makes people vulnerable to CSEC. We often talk about human trafficking as if it is something new, but it's not, right? This is not a new phenomenon. If we are, studying even the realities of the construction of the United States, right, we know that the United States was built on human trafficking, right? And so the reality is that these systems of oppression, the violence that is manifested through these systems of oppression make people who are marginalized really susceptible to this. Because the reality is that people get into it for various different reasons. Some of it is they need money, right? I've heard different stories about, I need to be able to support myself. I've heard stories of just, as Holly brought up earlier, the coercion, right? So maybe you have some young women or young femmes who are seeking this masculine energy, male attention. And as a result of that, the right man tells them the right thing and then are able to persuade them that somehow their body is going to be this ticket to joy and happiness, right? So many risk factors, but those are the major ones that I have seen in my work.
I think that was a great answer to the big question.
Yeah, really, it is. So really, we are looking at the marginalized populations, of course, being more at risk and more vulnerable. Really, when we're talking about risk factors, it all comes back to vulnerability and vulnerabilities, which is what makes us all human. There's not a person, I'm sure, in this Zoom call who doesn't have any kind of vulnerabilities. And some days maybe we have more than others. And so, you know, but really this is an issue that it's, you know, it comes, we have people from different socioeconomic statuses, people of different genders, people of different races who are all, you know, could all be at risk for this. So, yeah, it comes down to vulnerabilities for sure.
Right. Thank you both. So moving forward, oftentimes victims are seen as criminals in the legal system, and especially within human trafficking, I think they find themselves in other sort of criminal situations besides what's happening to them right then and there. So like that big barrier, where else are the barriers in the legal system for victims to receive help?
I mean, I'm thinking of so many, it's a big question. I mean, these people, a lot of the times who've been victims of trafficking, there's a lot of kind of like inherent mistrust of law enforcement, of, you know, service providers. And so that's a huge barrier because of the criminalization. You know, when we're looking at like undocumented folks who maybe have experienced trafficking, that could be one too. There's so many I can think of. Those are just a couple that they're coming up.
Yeah. Again, not to be redundant, but just to be clear, again, the legal system, you mean that the critique of that and the analyzation of that is a college class, right? Like literally. But the reality is that, again, who are we talking about? Who is being seen as a criminal, right? In the legal system. And more than likely it's going to be Black and brown. It's going to be undocumented, non-white undocumented folks, right? That are going to largely be seen and viewed as a criminal. And we've seen that even in the Centoya Brown case, right? Where she, it took her years, right, to be exonerated of killing her rapist, a predator, right, who was had bought her for sex. And, you know, she was viewed for years and still largely is probably by many people still viewed as a criminal for what she did. And so, yeah, I think another thing too is when we talk about anything in regards to sex and sexuality, we have to have very particular conversations around what the consciousness around sex is in our culture, right? And because sex, irregardless of how it manifests, because sex is largely seen still as something that is shameful, something that is seen as you do it in the dark, you do it undercover, it's this thing you do behind closed doors. That will impact how we see anything in relationship to sex, because we have such a negative consciousness around sex as a society. We're still working on trying to build a sex positive society, and we've seen a lot of movements over the past couple years that have helped shift that, but we're still in a very dangerous place about how we even view sex, right? So this is the case for even grown people who engage in consensual sex work are still like, we're not even talking about the violent and dark side of sex work, but the people who actually are like, I'm just out here living my life and I'm having sex and I'm getting paid for it, and they're still being seen as monsters. So, yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing up sex work a little bit more. I think that that is a very, especially amongst human trafficking, and I think when we're trying to think about the legal solutions, we bring in sex work as well, and you know what is okay, what is not okay. So kind of coming back, I guess, to like the legal system, and I guess like these policies, and both of your opinions. What do you feel like are the, I guess, biggest maybe policy solutions that could come to mind, or those sort of changes that need to be made on, you know, in like the government sector that need to get done?
Oof. Well, definitely. Okay, so when we bring up the conversation about sex work, again, I'm not even referencing like human trafficking, right? I'm just talking about sex work here. I work from the perspective that sex work should be decriminalized, not legalized. Those are different perspectives. Legalization and decriminalization are very separate. And for those of you who are listening that may not understand that, decriminalization just says that I am not going to I'm not going to criminalize you. I'm not going to lock you up or, you know, create this legal battle for you because of you engaging in sex work. And legalization then says I own and create boundaries for how you engage in sex work, right? So I think that that's one part of it. I think the other part of it is, I don't know legally if it, legally, I don't know if that's where we need to begin, because there are so many societal issues that even contribute to why human trafficking is even a thing in the first place. And I think until we address the psyche of our country, of our world, unfortunately, things could shift legally and people could still do it. I mean, you know, like, does that make sense what I'm saying? I mean, like, people do things that are illegal every day, you know, so.
Oh yeah, it makes total sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would have to agree with Maisha. I mean, I think definitely the decriminalization is huge, because there's so much shame and, you know, punishment, and just like thinking of these individuals who have been victimized, right, as like the bad person, right? And so thinking of it in a different way. But yeah, I think that there are a lot of societal issues that we have to be addressing, and we have to be aware of, because, you know, even we're like on the other side of things, right? We're looking at a society that glamorizes and sells sex, right, with our kind of like advertising and our media and our music, and, you know, and so that also contributes to kind of like the grooming process that is really like making us think that it's okay, right? And so when we're talking about the grooming process, you know, this is a lot of times what happens in, you know, before someone is actually trafficked, sex trafficked. There's like a relationship building stage and kind of like almost a brainwashing stage that a lot of times happens. And so our society really contributes to that too. So even policy changes around that, I think could be beneficial.
I did want to thank you, Holly, because you just jogged a memory for me. So I do want to bring this up. So LA County did some research. I want to say, I don't know if this was 2017, 16, but they did some research in LA County, and what they found was that it was anywhere between 70-90% were in the LA juvenile delinquent centers, and these were mostly, I want to say, Black girls that they were looking at. The 70-90% of them had been exposed to CSEC, and then of those 70-90% of those who had CSEC, I want to say 60-70% of them had childhood sexual abuse that had already taken place prior to that CSEC exposure, right? So going back to your question about what makes people vulnerable, right? Sexual abuse in their homes or in their communities. And so the reason why I bring this up and why I say it's important to talk about this is because some other research was conducted. I want to say it was through Black Women's Blueprint, which is a organization that addresses sexual abuse, healing for sexual abuse for Black women and femmes. And they have a theory that's called the sexual abuse to prison pipeline. And what they found is that a lot of what they found was, first of all, that Black girls were being suspended at faster and abnormal rates in comparison to white girls. And it was for behavioral issues, right? But what they also found was that what laid at the crux of many of these behavioral issues was sexual abuse, was sexual trauma, right? And so why is that important to talk about? Well, again, because when we look at, our educational systems and how these are oftentimes training grounds for shipping a lot of our Black and brown youth off to prison into the legal system, we have to start to address them. What are our teachers, our administrators, staff, and faculty doing? How are they being trained to work with our youth, right? Because how don't you see the signs of sexual trauma as an educator and as an adult? Why are you not being trained to notice that and to see that and to deal with the behavioral issues adequately? So that just popped in my brain as you were talking, Holly, in terms of us looking at not just from a legal perspective, but just this societal issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're actually really lucky here in San Diego County because we have, first of all, California, our state has passed a law that does require various age groups of schools to educate their staff, their students, the parents about trafficking, and that includes labor trafficking and sex trafficking. But that law was only passed a couple of years ago, and so it's slowly getting implemented into all the schools. And so our some of our policymakers here in San Diego County have received pushback from some of those schools for going in, much like kind of when we're looking at sex education being brought into schools. And so they've been able to educate the schools and let them know this is a requirement now. And so and push back. And so now we're seeing it implemented, but we're gonna, we're slowly getting it in there, but it's happening. But we're lucky in Diego County because we have the resources, we have the programs. Not everywhere has that.
Right. Yeah, that's very important because I know that when I was doing CSEC work, there was a lot of pushback because a lot of schools felt like if we allow you to come in and do a work or education around CSEC, then we would have to acknowledge that there's a CSEC problem at our school, which then puts us in a legal problem, right? Because then now we got to acknowledge that we had a problem and wasn't doing nothing about it. So there's a lot of that happening. So yeah.
Thank you both for sharing. I think it definitely, at least for me, I hope for all of us listening, it definitely brings it into a bigger context about our systems and our institutions and how they are, making these risk factors even more risky for young people. So I want to get into now. So like both of you are advocates in this work, doing amazing things. So I guess I want to ask, maybe if a suggestion for just like the everyday citizen, what can they do just simply on their own time to help end human trafficking? And then maybe like on a deeper level, how can folks really get involved if this is something they feel passionately about?
I think that talking about it and telling someone after this panel today, hey, I just, listened to this panel and I learned this, and that, or, just kind of like bringing it into conversation because it's happening. People just, I think are afraid to kind of like talk about it because it is a really complex, complicated issue. But the more that we can kind of like bring that awareness and take it one step further, not just be a bystander. If we see something that doesn't look quite right and looks like it could be trafficking, taking it one step further and maybe doing something about it, submitting a tip to the human trafficking hotline, contacting, we have our intake line, and that's, where we receive referrals. But we also welcome questions, giving us a call if you have a question and you're like, hey, this didn't seem quite right. There's lots, I think, that you can do. And taking it one step further, if you really want to get involved, reaching out, and there's a lot of organizations, amazing organizations here in San Diego County that are always looking for volunteers, are always looking for donations. Lots of times when victims come out of the trafficking lifestyle, they leave with the clothes on their back. And so we always need donations, but there's lots that you can do to get involved.
Yeah. Just to add to that, so during this time I've been talking, I've been dropping a lot of nuggets and knowledge and gems. So I would encourage you to, if you haven't been already, to write down what we're saying, because that's going to be vital to you being able to do anything at all, is to read, write, and study, so that you actually know what you're doing, so you don't walk into things causing more harm. So that's the first thing. So definitely doing your research. Like, you can literally, I believe the research that I just told y'all about in LA County, I want to say if you Google LA County CSEC data or something like that, it should come up. So you can read it for yourself. Don't take, always question everything. You ain't got to believe nothing I say. Go look it up for yourself. And let's see. I say definitely taking some classes, because most of the folks in here are students, correct? Yes. Okay. So if you're not already, definitely at San Diego State, please utilize your Black studies, your Chicano studies, or Chicana X studies, your queer study classes. A lot of these classes have a race, gender, sexuality component to it. And I find them to be, if it was not for my my background and knowledge in these different areas, I would not have been able to do the work that I do as effectively. So I highly encourage for you all to dive into that very seriously.
Yes, thank you for sharing. I know there at least one course that is on sex trafficking in Europe that's offered at SDSU. I'm sure there's more. I guess lastly, I like that you brought up that, like, hope you guys are writing, or you all were writing stuff down. I think I want to give an opportunity, I guess, for both of you to maybe shout out some of, like, the organizations that are really getting it right in this area, who are doing really good work, giving people that opportunity to maybe write stuff down, whatever sticks out, the organizations you two work for, have worked for, whatever y'all want.
Yeah. So there's and I don't know if she's on Instagram. I don't know if she has a website or anything, but she's a former sex worker and survivor of human trafficking, and she has an organization here in San Diego called Sisters to the Streets. And she does some intervention and prevention work also with another sister here in San Diego. Her name is Ebony. And she also used to work for STARS as well. So they do some work, some curriculum work. I think Ebony is specifically, I don't know the name of her curriculum, and I'm sorry, I wish I could shout it out, but I don't remember what the name of it is. But I know she does some work around specifically working with boys, Black and brown boys, trying to make sure that they're also not being groomed into pimping, which is another side of this conversation that we often don't talk about. We tend to just focus on, making sure we're not like we're just focusing on the woman or girl or femme's perspective, and so she does a lot of bringing the other side of the conversation into it. And then again, I do want to, there is, like I said, San Diego Youth Services, again, that I think does some good work, but I also think it's important to shout out these other organizations that are doing more culturally affirming sort of work around the issue. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's so many organizations out here in San Diego. Of course, it's never enough because there's such a huge need. But we work with a lot of great organizations. Generate Hope is one that's, like a residential kind of shelter. We also work with Survivor Leader Network. They're doing a lot of different things in the community from that survivor perspective. We work with lots of other organizations that maybe they aren't just doing the human trafficking work, but they're, making that a part of their work, and they're aware of it, like Center for Community Solutions, who does domestic violence work, but they've also really embraced, working to identify human trafficking victims and support them, which hasn't always kind of been the case, because human trafficking is a whole nother animal, even though a lot of human trafficking victims also experience domestic violence. The LGBTQ centers, lots of different people. And then we also have some great, we have a great task force, who they're really the law enforcement folks who are going out, and doing lots of the operations and things like that. And then we also have our DA, our deputy DA, Summer Steffen, who's doing a lot of great work on a different kind of scale. So that's definitely not all of them, but just to give you an idea of a different kind of group.
Thank you. Yeah, I definitely encourage everyone to do some more research, go deep diving, learning about some more social issues that are affecting a lot of people. So that was my last question. So it concludes our panel tonight. I want to thank everyone for zooming in, and then especially you two, Holly and Maisha. Thank you so much for joining and giving us all such really important, valuable information. And I hope you all have a wonderful evening.
Mm-hmm.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Have a good night. Bye.